Hi there, my dear students. I would like to revise in this video the basis of this unit for the next test we are taking soon. The first thing I would like to remember is the geographical context in which the Greek civilization was developed. As far as you can see, the Mediterranean Sea was the place in which the Greeks were living. The main problem of this place, as far as you can remember from the first term lessons, is the lack of agricultural activity due to the mountains. The more mountains, the harder for agriculture. That's why, and also taking into account its geographical location, Greeks were forced to focus on trading as the chief economic activity. The second thing we must remember, but I won't highlight this thing too much, is that what we call today as the Greek civilization is the result of the collapse of two civilizations that had existed before, namely the Mycenaean and the Minoan one. But I rather prefer to focus on the different periods that compound the Greek civilization, namely the Archaic, the Classic, and the Hellenistic ones. Let's begin with the Archaic one. The Archaic period began with the collapse of the early Greek civilizations because of the Dark Era. Actually, we don't know the reasons by which this dramatic situation happened. Yet, without a shadow of doubt, what we know is the economic crisis Greece was through. I would like to bring up one question. Were you a Greek? What would you do in this scenario? Namely, living in an economic crisis. Migrating to another place to make your living, right? That's what we call the Greek colonization. Namely, most of the Greeks were forced to leave their homes to migrate to other places in order to make their living. Please remember from previous lessons that this process was commanded by the warrior aristocracy. The warrior aristocracy whose tasks were about leading the expeditions and also protecting the settlements of the Greeks were establishing. That's why the political power remained in this class. Why? Because one, they have the weapons, and secondly, they were leading the migrations. That's why we cannot call the Archaic era as a democratic one. Why? Because just a few amount of people were about making the political decisions. And why? Because they have the weapons, right? The Greek settlements were called polis, which were small city-states with two different areas, namely the dependent zone. Let's check the video. Okay. The dependent zone where the agricultural activities were carried out, and secondly, the urban places where the craft work, the religious, the trading, and the political activities were taking place, right? As far as you can see, this could be in the urban area, and these outskirts could be called as the dependent zone. But I would dare to say that the most interesting chapter of the Greek history was the Classic period. The things we must remember was, firstly, the first point was about the Greek-Persian Wars. The second order was the emergence of two different powers as the result of the first one, namely Athens on one side and Sparta on the other hand, and finally the battle between them. Let's analyze each point one by one. Regarding the first one, the Greco-Persian Wars, we must remember that the Persian Empire was developing in Asia. And from the Asia Minor coast, from here, it was harassing Greece. They wanted to take Greece. And that's why two battles happened, namely Marathon and Salamis. The victory was for Greece. And what was the key of this victory? The creation of the Delian League. And what was the Delian League? Well, all polis had to gather together against the same rival, which was the Persian Empire. That's why Athens proposed one idea, which was, what if we create one founding pot to afford the payment of the military defense to defend ourselves from the same enemy, which was the Persian Empire? Does it make sense? Every polis had to pay a few amount of taxes to afford the payment of the military defense. It makes sense, right? But a part of the money was for beauty Athens, to make Athens beautiful. And at the same time, Athens started to dominate the rest of the cities, of the Greek cities. That's why some polis revolted against the Athenian power. And they gathered together to face Athens, creating other league. Which one? The Peloponnese League. But before addressing the Peloponnese League, I would like to address that Athens and Sparta, well, Sparta was leading the Peloponnese League. Athens and Sparta were carrying out two different models in terms of politics and economics. Regarding Athens, we must say that it was an ancient democracy. We will be addressing the core of the ancient democracy later, in a matter of minutes. And, well, the economics of Athens was about trading. Let's check now the Peloponnesian League in general, but Sparta in particular. Regarding Sparta, its political system was about a diarchy, an aristocratic government. Diarchy means diarchy, kings to kings. The political decisions were made by an aristocratic government, whose main institution was the Council of Elders. And finally, well, the economics of Sparta was about agriculture. But the most important thing we must keep in mind is that Sparta was leading the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesian League faced the Delian one. And why? Because, as we have just said, part of the money of the founding pot was used by beauty Athens. That's why most of the polis were angry with Athens, and they decided to fight in the Peloponnesian War. Well, what was the result of the Peloponnesian War, namely the war between Athens and Sparta? Even though Sparta won this war, it was the hegemony of the Hellas remained finally in Macedonia, because both cities were quite weakened. But the most important point of this chapter is the ancient democracy, especially the differences between the ancient democracy and, as compared to the current one. The roots of the ancient democracy laid out in the social instability in Greece. Let's remember the core of this idea from previous lessons. As far as we can remember from other lessons, there were at least two groups. The privileged one, whose people didn't have to work and made their living by the taxes the non-privileged one was paying to them, and secondly, the non-privileged group. The non-privileged group didn't own the land, and that's why they had to ask for permission to the privileged group to work them and make their living. The privileged group led the non-privileged one to work at the land, but only if they pay taxes to them. That's why there were two groups. The privileged one, who controlled the land and the resources, and secondly, the non-privileged other, who worked the resources and to pay taxes to them. But there was one problem. Imagine you were a farmer and you didn't have enough crops to pay the taxes, or don't have enough money to pay the taxes. What would happen? You are becoming an slave. If a huge amount of farmers are becoming a slave, they will be angry against the privileged group. And that's why they revolt against them. This was the reason of the social instability in Greece that brought up the ancient democracy. Now, let's address the core idea of the ancient democracy. The Athenian citizens participate directly in government through the following institutions: the Ecclesia and the Leia. That's right. And finally, we are addressing the differences with the current democracy, which were the type of democracy. Meanwhile, the ancient one is a direct democracy, namely, all the citizens are making the decisions directly. The current one is a representative one. We are not taking these decisions directly, but voting to our politicians and the parties, right? Sorry, we don't choose the politicians, we are voting the parties. Secondly, whereas the current democracy, there is a separation of powers, the ancient one didn't own a separation of that. And finally, the citizenship. Meanwhile, the ancient democracy was about, have a limited citizenship, namely women, foreign people, and the slaves hadn't political rights. This one is universal. Every member of the society, except the illegal immigrations, are citizens. I hope you find useful this video, please. Should you have any question, don't just hesitate about texting me. See you soon.